You are in the wrong place. 5 words that can devastate a soul. That was exactly what Maya Jefferson felt that morning when she found herself alone in seat 2A of first class. At 16 years old, carrying a worn backpack full of dreams and a ticket earned through sacrifice, it took just one disdainful glance for her world to begin to crumble. The soft leather of the seat and the strong aroma of freshly brewed coffee couldn't disguise the tension that was about to explode. When the flight attendant appeared in the aisle, her high heels clicking rhythmically on the floor and a smile that vanished upon seeing Maya, she already knew what was coming. Without even checking her boarding pass, the verdict was pronounced. "Sweetheart, I think you're in the wrong section." And in that instant, everything around her began to collapse. Maya froze. Around her, other passengers pretended not to notice, but the discomfort was palpable, like a cold wind blowing down the airplane aisle. Maya unzipped her jacket and took out her boarding pass with both hands, her palms sweaty, the paper crumpled, showing the seat number. "This is it. 2A, she said, her voice nearly choked. But the flight attendant had already made up her mind. "Come on, we don't want to delay the flight," she said, now speaking louder, loud enough to draw the attention of nearby rows. Maya still tried to argue, but the woman merely reached out for the girl's backpack, as if helping someone move from where they shouldn't be. Humiliated, her face burning, Maya stood up, clutched her backpack to her chest and began walking down the narrow aisle, feeling the weight of every gaze on her back. It was as if each step confirmed that she truly didn't belong there, and no one, absolutely no one, did anything to stop it. When Maya reached the back of the plane, she found an empty window seat and threw herself into it, still clutching her backpack as if it were the only thing anchoring her there. She didn't cry, not yet, but her eyes burned, as if all the embarrassment was trying to escape in the form of tears. Her head spun. It felt like being trapped in one of those bad dreams where you try to scream and no one hears you. She knew she had the right to be there. She knew that ticket had been paid for with sweat, not luck. But in that moment, what weighed most wasn't the ticket, nor the seat assignment, nor the law. It was the flight attendant's look. It was the silence of the others. It was how, without uttering a single offensive word, she had been pushed out of her own space as if she were invisible. She pressed her cool forehead against the window. Outside, the sky seemed to close in grey, as if even the weather understood what she was feeling. Inside her jacket, her phone vibrated. It was an automatic message from the airline welcoming her on board. Almost ironic, she thought. Maya took a deep breath and opened her messaging app. Her hand hesitated for a second. Part of her wanted to forget it had happened, to pretend it was nothing, that she was overreacting. But another part, the part that had studied late into the night, that had earned her spot in this summer program through sacrifice, that believed she could be someone in this world, refused to let it pass silently. So she wrote simply, almost coldly, "They made me leave my seat. They said I couldn't stay in first class. I'm in the back now." As she sent the message, her stomach churned. The recipient was Evelyn, her godmother, her anchor, a woman she admired more than anyone in the world. Evelyn wasn't about drama, she was about action. When something was wrong, she fixed it. When something was unjust, she faced it head-on. Maya knew that if anyone could do something, it was Evelyn. Yet even so, when she hit send, Maya did not expect much. Deep down, she was already used to being ignored. The world didn't always care about girls like her. Maybe it would be just another day where nothing changed. Maybe she'd have to swallow it and move on like so many times before. The plane remained stationary on the tarmac. Passengers murmured here and there, growing impatient. Flight attendants moved about as if nothing had happened. The pilot announced over the PA that there would be a slight delay for operational reasons. Calm, rehearsed. Maya closed her eyes and leaned her head against the hard seat of economy class. Then her phone vibrated again. Only 2 words appeared on the screen, short, swift, as direct as an arrow. "Tell me everything." Her heart jumped in her chest. She knew in that moment that something, maybe just a small thing, maybe something enormous, was about to change. Maya stared at her screen for a few seconds, her thumb frozen over the keyboard. It was strange how something so small, 2 words, could carry so much weight. She took a deep breath, trying to sort through the confusion in her head. Her fingers began to type almost on autopilot. "They kicked me out of first class. The attendant didn't even look properly at my ticket. She said I was in the wrong place. Asked where my parents were and told me to come back here. No one did anything. I'm in the back now." She reread the message before sending it, as if reliving every second of the humiliation. When she pressed send, she felt as though she had reopened the wound, but this time she wouldn't let it heal carelessly. She leaned back against the window, feeling the faint vibration of the plane under her back. But now what vibrated most was something inside her, a thread of hope mixed with anger hard to separate. It didn't take more than 30 seconds for the reply to arrive. Evelyn was always quick. "Send me the flight number." "Now." Maya hurriedly rummaged through her backpack until she found the slightly crumpled ticket. Her fingers trembled as she keyed in the information. Once sent, she stared at the blank screen as if she could see her godmother on the other side, quietly moving pieces. It was strange to think about it, how all of a sudden she wasn't alone in that situation anymore. Just knowing someone believed her, that someone wouldn't pretend they hadn't seen, already made some of the weight lift from her shoulders. Still, she knew. Nothing guaranteed that this would change anything. Sometimes even those with power meet closed doors. But Evelyn was no ordinary person. Time dragged on. A minute felt like an hour. Passengers grew restless, murmuring softly. Some unclipped their seatbelts, thinking the flight might soon be cancelled. Maya sat quietly in her corner, fiddling with the zipper of her backpack, eavesdropping on fragments of conversation. Technical issue? Is it fuel? This is taking too long. No one suspected the real reason. The sense of being the only one who knew was strange. It wasn't pleasant. She didn't want this to have happened. But there was a flicker there, almost imperceptible, of something new. Perhaps for the first time, she wouldn't be the one bowing her head. Up front, Barbara, the flight attendant who had humiliated her, paced the aisle with impatient steps. Maya could see through the gap between seats. The woman adjusted her uniform tie, fiddled with the radio clipped to her waist, exchanged curt words with her crewmates. But there was something different in her movements now, tension in her jaw, an uneasy look that hadn't been there before. Maybe she too felt that something in the air had shifted, like a storm brewing beyond the clouds. Maya rested her head on the cold wall of the aircraft and closed her eyes for a moment, trying to ground herself, feeling the hard upholstery beneath her body, the low hum of the engines, the stale coffee scent in the aisle. Everything was real. She wasn't imagining it. And for the first time that day she believed she wasn't the one who was wrong. The captain walked down the narrow aisle, his steps trying to be discreet, but bearing a visible weight. He stopped near the first row of economy class and spoke quietly to one of the younger flight attendants, who hesitated before nodding almost imperceptibly. Maya watched everything from afar, without making any sudden moves, but every fiber of her being was alert. The captain returned to the cockpit, and seconds later, his voice came through the PA. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have received a request to remain on the ground for a few more minutes while we conduct an internal procedures check. We appreciate your understanding." The announcement was polite, but the tension in the crew's eyes indicated it wasn't just routine. Maya pressed her fingers against her backpack, feeling the warmth of her palm contrasting with the cold zipper fabric. At the back of the plane, some passengers began complaining out loud. A man in a suit seated 2 rows ahead of Maya pulled out his phone and started typing angry messages. 2 women traveling together exchanged suspicious glances, grumbling about the airline. Amid it all, Maya remained silent. She felt as if the entire plane was suspended in a collective breath that could not yet be released. Maya's phone vibrated again, but she didn't dare look immediately. It was as though the world had been put on pause at that moment. A bubble of silence, of waiting, of mingled fear and hope. Finally, she unlocked her phone. The message was brief. "Stay where you are. They will call you." Maya's heart leapt. Part of her wanted to believe it, to allow herself to imagine this. Wouldn't end like every other time she'd been silenced, ignored, belittled, but another part, a larger part, shaped by years of painful experiences, braced for the worst. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her thighs and hiding her face in her hands for a few seconds. She breathed deeply, inhaling slowly through her nostrils, smelling the cheap fabric of the seat. All she wanted at that moment was to disappear, but she wouldn't. Not this time. Somewhere at the front of the plane, a different murmur began. The movement was tenser now. Maya raised her eyes slowly and saw Barbara being discreetly summoned to the cockpit. The other flight attendants exchanged uncertain looks, not knowing what to do. An uncomfortable silence settled over first class. Maya straightened her back in her seat, feeling a mix of anxiety and adrenaline pulsing inside her. Maybe no one there knew it yet, but something was about to happen, and for the first time, it wouldn't be her who stayed silent. Inside the cockpit, the atmosphere felt heavier. Barbara stood rigid before the captain, who spoke in a low but firm tone. He held a direct-line phone from the airline, and beside him lay a sheet of quick notes. Barbara tried to maintain a professional demeanor, but the sweat discreetly dripping down her face betrayed her. The captain explained there had been an official complaint from a very high-ranking official, and that until further notice no one would be leaving the airport. They want explanations now. His voice wasn't asking, it was ordering. Barbara opened her mouth to justify herself, but the words wouldn't come. For the first time, the certainty she'd held slipped from her grasp. The captain handed her the internal communications headset. The line was already open. On the other end, a cold, precise voice waited. James Sandler from the FAA team, speaking on behalf of Director Evelyn Brooks. "We've confirmed that passenger Maya Jefferson had a valid first-class ticket." "Correct." The question, though simple, felt like a trap. Barbara stammered. She showed a ticket, but the voice cut her off. "Did you verify it with the onboard system? Check with ground staff? Or did you decide based solely on the passenger's appearance?" The ensuing silence was mortifying. The captain averted his eyes as if giving her privacy to fail alone. Barbara felt her face flush, her heart race. I made a wrong decision," she admitted, her voice breaking. The response was swift, firm, leaving no room for misunderstanding. "You are to apologize formally to the passenger. In front of all first-class patrons, you will escort her back to her seat, and upon landing, you will be suspended pending investigation. Understood?" Barbara could barely nod. She merely nodded, even though she knew no one on the other end of the line could see it. When she removed the headset, her hands shook so much she had to brace herself against the cockpit wall to avoid collapsing. Never in her years of service had she been held accountable in such a manner. Never had she felt the real weight of a prejudiced choice so directly. Outside, the first-class aisle was deathly silent. Some passengers suspected something major was unfolding. Others simply looked around, irritated by the delay. Maya, back in economy, watched the activity, but didn't know exactly what was being decided. All she knew was that for some reason, one she didn't yet fully understand, that day would not be like the others when she'd been humiliated without a voice. For the first time, the scales seemed to tip in her favor, but she still didn't know how it would end. She only held tight to her hope, as if it were a fragile thread. Barbara walked down the aisle with hesitant steps, feeling the weight of every gaze. Even though most passengers remained distracted, fiddling with phones or chatting softly, she no longer carried the erect, confident posture from the flight's start. Now, there was a slump in her shoulders, a nervous grinding of her hands, a pathetic attempt to appear in control. When she passed the divider between first class and economy, a few sharp-eyed travelers followed her with their eyes, as though they sensed something was amiss. Maya saw her approach from afar. For a moment she thought perhaps they were asking her to leave the plane altogether. Fear rose again, bitter in her throat. But something in the woman's expression, a lost look, a trembling mouth, made her suspect this. Time would be different. Barbara stopped in front of Maya's seat. She took a deep breath, lowered her eyes for a moment, and then, in a hoarse voice of someone swallowing more than pride, said, "Miss Jefferson, I would like to apologize." The words sounded rehearsed, hollow. Maya remained silent, gazing at her without blinking. It was strange to see someone who had radiated authority now seem so small. The aisle around them grew quieter, as though the air had been sucked into a bubble. Barbara cleared her throat, trying to summon strength she didn't have. "I made a grave error in questioning your presence in first class without cause. It was a lapse in judgment. I apologize publicly." The words came out forced, weighted like stones. Maya didn't respond immediately. She wanted to be sure that this time the right person carried the weight. Unhurried, Maya stood. Her legs wobbled slightly, but she held her posture steady. She looked around and saw that now several passengers were watching, some ashamed, others with morbid curiosity. She adjusted the backpack strap on her shoulder and said, in a calm, almost cold tone, "Then let's go back." That was all. No drama, no speech. but in the way she lifted her chin, in the way she looked straight ahead as she walked down the aisle, there was a strength no one could ignore. Barbara, humiliated, followed a step behind, a shameful shadow. As they returned to the front of the plane, the atmosphere shifted. People whispered, averted. Their eyes pretended to check their seatbelts or the ceiling. In first class, some smoothed their clothes nervously, others just watched without blinking. Maya reached seat 2A and sat down again, with the calm of someone who knows she belongs there. Her backpack returned to the floor and she buckled her seatbelt. Without looking at Barbara, Maya opened the book she had brought, not to read, but to show that for her, this matter was closed. The flight attendant, with nowhere else to go, retreated slowly, her face flushed, her trembling hands pretending to be busy with anything. The plane felt different now, not because anything physical had changed, but because something invisible lingered in the air. When Maya settled into seat 2A, it was as if she had reclaimed more than just a chair. She had regained a piece of herself that had nearly been torn away that morning. The cold leather no longer felt as uncomfortable. The open book on her lap remained still, while her eyes pretended to follow the letters. In truth, she was listening to the discomfort of the other passengers, to their nervous movements, to their disguised throat clearings. Maya realized that, whether she wanted to admit it or not, she had become the center of attention there. But for the first time, she did not shrink. She did not apologize for taking up space. Beside her, an elderly man with gray hair fumbled with his wristwatch, as if it might make him vanish from the scene. A woman in a blue blazer in the row ahead adjusted her scarf 3 times in less than a minute, avoiding Maya's glance every time she moved. It was strange, but it was also just, because their previous silence, their choice not to see what happened, had been as cruel as Barbara's direct humiliation. Maya knew that the shame they felt now wasn't about her, it was about themselves, and in some quiet way, that comforted her. She didn't need to shout or expose anyone. Their own discomfort was justice unfolding before her eyes. Amid the timid buzz that began to swell, Barbara struggled to keep busy. She organized trays, offered hot towels, filled out forms with absurd concentration for such mundane tasks. But anyone watching her closely would notice she was crumbling inside. Her gestures were hasty and awkward. At times she mixed up the service order, knocked over small items, and muttered apologies almost beseechingly. The veneer of authority and control she had carried at the start of the flight had dissolved, revealing a small, fragile woman crushed by the weight of her own arrogance. The captain made another announcement. "Thank you for your patience. The operational issue has been resolved, and we will be taking off shortly." His tone was no longer automatic. It was more thoughtful, as if he knew something much larger than routine procedures was at play. Maya closed her book calmly, looked out the window, and saw runway lights moving in the distance. A new kind of feeling took hold of her. It wasn't exactly happiness, it was something deeper, more mature, a silent certainty that something inside her had changed forever. She was no longer just a girl who accepted what she was told. She was someone who knew her worth, and now everyone else knew it too. The plane began to taxi down the runway, and Maya felt the slight push against her seat back, the subtle movement that signals liftoff. But inside her, it was as if another journey was beginning, one that involved no altitude or physical distance. It was an inner voyage of reconstruction. She crossed her arms over her chest and watched the reflection of the cabin interior in the window. The fluorescent lights cast pale images of passengers' faces, tired, nervous, ashamed. Maya realized how easy it was for people to ignore injustices happening just 2 meters away, to pretend they didn't see. It was a kind of silent violence, different from explicit aggression, but equally destructive. Only today, at least today, that violence had run up against a barrier. The sound of the engines increasing filled the cabin, drowning out voices and uneasy sighs. Maya fastened her belt and closed her eyes for a moment, not because she was afraid of takeoff, but because she needed internal silence to process everything she felt. There was still pain. There was still the sting of humiliation, like a fresh wound that throbbed every time she recalled the flight attendant's look of disdain. But alongside the pain, there was also a strange spark, uncomfortable and comforting at the same time, a feeling of strength, of resistance, as if something inside her had solidified where it used to be fragile. She would never be the same after that, not because the world had changed, but because she had changed the way she saw herself in it. When the plane finally lifted off, surging skyward with that classic lurch, Maya kept her eyes closed, savoring each vibration, each jolt. She thought of Evelyn. She thought how, even without being physically present, her godmother had managed to do what few adults did: believe in her without question, fight for her without hesitation. It was different from most advice, those empty reassurances of, "Don't mind them, let it go, it's not worth the trouble." Evelyn had shown through concrete action that Maya's dignity mattered, that she deserved respect just like any other passenger on that plane, realizing that truth was perhaps more important than anything else. When she opened her eyes again, Maya saw the sky through the window, a sea of white clouds lit by the morning sun. It was beautiful, simple and beautiful. She gave a slight, almost involuntary smile, then pulled the blanket offered by the airline over her legs. It was no longer about what they had done to her. It was about what she had refused to accept, about keeping her head high, even when everything seemed to push her down. Maya knew there would still be many barriers ahead. There would probably be other bad days, but that day, the day she refused to accept invisibility, was hers, and no one could take that away. While Maya closed her eyes to absorb that new silent strength, up front, Barbara Finch faced an entirely different battle. Leaning discreetly against the galley wall, pretending to organize utensils, she was actually trying to keep her composure. Her heart pounded so hard, it seemed to echo within her tight uniform. She had never felt so exposed, so small, so wrong. It was hard to explain. It wasn't just fear of suspension or official punishment. It was something else. A harsh shame, almost physical, that scraped her insides every time she recalled Maya's glare as she walked toward the back of the plane. Barbara knew deep down the girl had done nothing wrong, that the error had been hers, that without a second thought she had judged and condemned a teenager based on an old poison she never had the courage to admit she carried. She rested both hands on the small metal counter and squeezed her eyes shut, drawing in a deep breath. The FAA manager's words still echoed in her ears. "You judged the passenger by appearance." It felt like a punch to the stomach. For the first time in years, Barbara found herself without excuses. She couldn't claim haste, protocol, or legitimate suspicion. She had simply seen Maya, seen her skin color, seen her age, and decided she wasn't worthy of that seat. And she acted as if it were natural, as if she were upholding some unwritten rule, taught instinctively. The weight of that realization was brutal. She tried to convince herself it was merely a lapse in judgment, but deep down, she knew it was much older, much more ingrained. As she served meals to first-class passengers, her hands trembling, her voice wavering, Barbara noticed the looks that people shot away from her. Some passengers ignored her completely, as if she were part of the furniture. Others accepted trays with an automatic nod, avoiding any eye contact. It was as if she had become invisible in the very space where she once reigned with authority. That sensation of being seen as unwelcome, of not being recognized as legitimate, was new to her, and it hurt. Maybe, Barbara thought, as she placed a tray down for the third time in the same spot, maybe that was exactly what Maya felt every day without having a choice. The idea hit her like a blow, and for a brief moment she had to lean against the wall to keep herself from collapsing right there in front of everyone. The plane continued its journey, cutting through the clouds as if nothing had happened. But inside the cabin, amid trembling meal services and forced, hushed conversations drowned by the engine's hum, something had shifted. Maya sensed, even without looking at anyone, that she had taken control of something larger than a seat assignment. She had unwittingly transformed the entire environment around her. And across the aisle, Barbara was, for the first time in her life, forced to face the worst version of herself, and to realize that if she wanted to preserve any dignity, she needed to change, not because someone told her to, but because now she knew. And once you know, you can't pretend you didn't see. The flight pressed on, but time seemed to stop for Barbara. Every minute dragged as if someone had hit a slow-motion button just for her. While collecting empty trays, her hands trembled, and she had to focus on each simple motion. Hold, smile, thank. But it felt like acting in a body that no longer responded as it used to. She felt cold sweat pooling at the nape of her neck, soaking the back of her uniform where no one could see. Each time she passed by a row, she sensed passengers' eyes on her, brief, furtive glances. It was as if they knew, as if the whole plane was heavy with the knowledge of what she had done. It was unbearable. It was deserved. In the galley, she leaned against the wall, away from passengers' view, and closed her eyes for a few seconds. For the first time, she let the memory return uncensored. Maya's face, the boarding pass extended, the automatic rejection. Maya's polite, hopeful voice trying to explain, and Barbara's cutting command, sending the girl away. When she opened her eyes, something different shone in them, a mix of dread and recognition. She realized that the sensation, the burning face, the tightness in the chest, the urge to vanish, was exactly what Maya had felt earlier. Only for Maya, it wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a lifetime of unexplained closed doors. Barbara ran a hand through her tightly pinned bun. She wondered, for the first time in years, who had taught her to act that way, who had convinced her without words that some people didn't belong in certain places. She thought of her own childhood, growing up in a home where prejudice was never spoken of outright, but where uncomfortable jokes slipped into dinner conversation, where natural suspicion seemed part of one's upbringing. She recalled sideways glances her parents cast at different neighbors. She thought about never having been taught to question those feelings, only to accept them as silent truths, invisible rules about who was rightfully allowed where. It was painful to admit maybe she hadn't just made a one-time mistake. Maybe for years she'd carried a poison she never questioned, and now, on this plane, in front of a teenager who had done absolutely nothing wrong, all that became visible, palpable, impossible to ignore. It was like seeing a dirty mirror held up before her. Back in the galley, pretending to check meal arrangements, Barbara felt something new begin to grow inside her. It was an old shame, but also something beyond, the real need for change, not out of fear of losing her job, not to avoid formal punishment, but because now she understood what it meant to be the cause of a humiliation that scars someone forever. And understanding was different from hearing. Knowing was different from being reprimanded. Knowing was like carrying an invisible scar no one could erase. For the first time in a long while, Barbara wanted to learn, not to appear better, but to be better. She knew it wouldn't be quick, nor easy, but for the first time, truly, she wanted to try. High above the clouds, Maya finally allowed her body to relax in the seat for the first time since boarding. The exhaustion, which had been masked by tension, finally hit her. But it wasn't just physical. It felt like a soul-deep fatigue from carrying a fight that isn't always visible, but is present in every gesture, every sideways glance, every explanation she must give to justify her presence where it should be obvious she belongs. She pulled the blanket up to her chest, leaned her head against the window frame and stared blankly at the horizon. She didn't want to think, but thoughts came anyway. She thought about younger Maya, who might have accepted the humiliation without telling anyone, who would have stepped down from the plane without complaint, swallowed the shame, hidden the pain. But this Maya who sent the message, who didn't bow her head completely, was different, and she knew that, even if no one else saw it, that was a victory. Meanwhile, in the galley, Barbara still clung to the small tasks of service to avoid sinking completely. Each cleared tray, each forced smile was a desperate attempt to feel useful, to not disappear under the weight of guilt. But deep down, she understood there was nothing she could do on that flight to undo what happened. Nothing that could be said or done to fix it with a hasty apology or overt kindness. She had marked that girl. And worse, she had done so in the cowardliest way, using the authority of her uniform to camouflage her prejudice. The realization was cruel, yet liberating. Barbara would not fool herself again. She knew that the path to correction, if it even existed, would be long, uncomfortable, and solitary, and it was hers alone. As the hours passed, the cabin's atmosphere grew more monotonous, as if everyone silently decided to pretend nothing significant had occurred. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, tablets were turned on, newspapers unfolded. But for Maya, nothing was normal, and perhaps it never would be. Instead of seeking distraction, she allowed herself to reflect, calmly, on what it all meant. It wasn't just about an airplane seat. It wasn't just about a rude flight attendant. It was about how the world treated people like her automatically, unconsciously, daily. It was about the fatigue of having to prove her worth from the moment she stepped into a room. It was about the loneliness of knowing that often no one would defend her unless she defended herself. It was hard to realize with such clarity, but at the same time, there was a quiet strength growing inside her, a strength that didn't come from acceptance, but from resistance. The descent announcement cut through the system's hum, snapping Maya out of her thoughts. She stretched her legs, refastened her belt, and looked out the window one last time before landing. Below, towns began to appear like golden patches on the ground. Everything looked so small from up there. The streets, the buildings, the cars running like ants. She thought about how human injustices would be invisible from that height, about how easy it is to ignore what's wrong when you observe from so far away. But there, in seat 2A, on that particular day, Maya knew. She had chosen to see, and that changed everything. Maybe it was small, maybe the world would consider it invisible, but inside her, it was immense. When the plane's wheels finally touched down with a solid thud, it felt like a summary of everything Maya felt. A sudden, strong shock, but a necessary one. She exhaled slowly, as if emptying a burden she had carried throughout the flight. Cabin lights came on, and the clink of seatbelts unfastening began almost immediately. Maya kept her hands still on her lap in no hurry. There was no need to rush. For the first time in a long while, she felt no urgency to leave, no need to shrink to fit somewhere. On the contrary, she wanted to savor that moment. She was exhausted, yes, but she was also whole, and nothing that had happened on that plane had managed to steal that from her. Barbara remained at the rear of first class, by the curtain dividing the sections, watching passengers stand, adjust their bags, murmur farewells. She knew she needed to follow protocol until the very last second, but her legs felt like stone. She also knew that upon exiting the plane, she would have to report to the airline supervisor, who had already been notified by the FAA. Her suspension was practically certain, but oddly, that wasn't what hurt the most. What hurt was the bare awareness that the problem wasn't merely the mistake made on that flight. It was a lifetime of automatic behaviors, silent judgments that day had become impossible to ignore. She looked down at the floor, straightening her crooked ID badge as if trying to compose herself, without much success. As the disembarkation line began to move, Maya stood calmly, her backpack on her shoulder, the blue-covered book she hadn't even opened, held against her chest. As she walked down the aisle, she didn't seek anyone's nod of approval, nor expect apologies from strangers. She knew many would feel better pretending nothing had happened. That was fine. Her fight had never been for the validation of strangers. It was a fight for her own dignity, and as she passed Barbara, she felt a strange pang, not of anger as she might have expected, but something closer to pity. She didn't stop. She said nothing. She simply walked on with her head high, aware that even if invisible to many, she was leaving a trace in her wake. Stepping into the jet bridge, Maya felt the cold airport air hit her face. She inhaled deeply. The metallic smell of the terminal, mingled with distant notes of coffee and cleaning products, filled her nostrils. Never had such an ordinary smell felt so symbolic. She was there, whole, and out of the environment where they had tried to diminish her. It wasn't a perfect ending, nor a tale of triumphant justice repaired in seconds. It was just real life, painful, complicated, full of small knots we have to untie one by one. But Maya knew that day she had won a battle many wouldn't even see, and that was enough. The airport terminal felt like another world, compared to the stifling interior of the plane. Maya walked slowly, the shiny floor beneath her sneakers, the bright lights overhead, all mixed with rolling suitcases, crying children, and constant announcements. But for her, it was all indistinct background. Her body moved on autopilot, but inside each step carried weight, and at the same time, an inexplicable lightness. It was as if she had passed through an invisible storm and was now feeling the silence that follows the gale. In her jacket pocket, her phone vibrated with a discreet notification. She pulled it out, already knowing who it was from. "I'm waiting at gate 4, read Evelyn's brief, firm message. Maya closed the message and took a deep breath before continuing. Meanwhile, Barbara Finch walked down a service door flanked by 2 airline employees. She trudged along, head bowed, chin nearly touching her collar. Each step was heavy, mechanical. There were no glances, no exchanged words with her companions. It was as if everyone knew this was a farewell path, a rupture, and once taken there would be no return to the life she'd known. In the small administrative office of the airport, she would be officially informed of her suspension and the start of the investigation. She understood that, but what truly hurt was the knowledge that regardless of the investigation's outcome, the image she had of herself would never be the same. It was as though she had lost an innocence she never deserved to carry. On her way to the gate, Maya navigated the crowd without focusing on anyone, feeling the backpack's weight like a comforting anchor. She didn't want to talk to anyone or make eye contact. She didn't need pitying looks or speeches about strength. When she spotted Evelyn standing by a concrete pillar, it was like finding a beacon in the chaos. Evelyn was there, arms crossed, wearing a beige coat, her gaze steady. The same expression as always, strong, serene, unbearably clear-headed. As Maya approached, Evelyn opened her arms without a word, and Maya allowed herself a silent embrace, closing her eyes a few seconds longer than usual. It was in that hug that Maya felt something melt inside her. Not weakness, not surrender, but simply the permission to not have to carry everything alone all the time. They walked toward the parking lot at a leisurely pace, side by side, with no need to fill the silence with words. The afternoon sun cast long shadows on the cracked asphalt, and the sharp smell of gasoline mixed with the dry, hot air. Maya knew Evelyn understood everything without needing details. She knew that even if Maya recounted every single moment, Evelyn would already have felt it all by how Maya walked, how she breathed, how she held her backpack strap. When they reached the car, Evelyn unlocked the doors with a click and placed a hand on her goddaughter's shoulder before she climbed in. "You did everything right," she said in a tone so sincere that Maya felt her eyes sting. But she blinked quickly to stave off tears. She didn't want to cry, not in sadness, maybe in relief. The car pulled away from the airport slowly, blending into the stream of shuttles and honking taxis. Evelyn drove with the calm of someone who respects others' silence, her left hand steady on the wheel, her right lingering on the gear shift, occasionally tapping her fingers in a slow rhythm. Maya looked out the window, watching the city pass by like a silent film. The radio played soft instrumental music, the kind that fills a space without intruding. She let herself be carried by the melody and the memories of the day. She no longer thought about the flight attendant herself. She thought about the entire structure, about how easily one can be erased in seconds, about how exhausting it is to have to constantly reaffirm your right to exist in every place. Meanwhile, Barbara sat alone in a small grey office in the terminal. The airline supervisor read aloud the temporary removal protocol, but the words sounded muffled to her, like hearing the world through a thick barrier underwater. She just listened to phrases like inappropriate conduct, internal evaluation, mandatory sensitivity sessions. She didn't react, because deep down, she already knew this was only the beginning. And unlike previous moments in her career when she could soften or explain away her mistakes, this time there was no excuse. What needed to happen wasn't correcting a single incident, it was deconstructing everything built inside her over years, and she understood now that it would be a long, uncomfortable, lonely journey, and it was hers alone. In the car, Maya adjusted her backpack in her lap and glanced at Evelyn. She saw on her godmother's face a mixture of serenity and concern, as one who trusts but never fully relaxes, because she knows too much about the world for that. Maya gave a small smile. For the first time, she felt she carried within her the same silent strength she'd always seen in her godmother. She didn't need to give speeches or promise great battles. It was enough to stand firm, to hold her line of dignity when the world tried to pull her down. It was simple and brutal at the same time, and now she knew she could. When the car stopped in front of Evelyn's house, Maya got out and hoisted her backpack onto her shoulders. The sky was turning orange, and for a moment she stood on the sidewalk, watching the clouds dissolve on the horizon. The cool breeze brushed her face and tousled a few strands of hair. In that moment she realized the pain of that day wasn't something she wanted to forget. It was something she wanted to carry, not as a burden, but as an invisible medal, the reminder that, even when pushed to the margins, she had resisted, and from now on, no matter how hard they tried, she would never let them erase who she was.